talk about something most people avoid, death. Not in a morbid way, but in a way that could actually change how you live, starting right now. From the moment you first heard the word death, you were taught to fear it. Maybe it was a hushed conversation in a hospital, a cartoon villain falling off a cliff, or a preacher warning about hell. But here's the thing, it was never just about death. It was about control. The unknown had to be terrifying, so you'd stay in line, follow the rules, and never ask what's really on the other side. But what if that fear was never really yours? What if death isn't the end at all, but the start of something bigger, something you were always meant to remember? The so-called Book of Death isn't a prophecy of doom. It's a message hidden in plain sight, wrapped in symbols and stories, waiting for you to notice. Because death isn't what you think. It never was. And if you really hear this, it could change how you live, starting now. You weren't born afraid of death. That fear was handed to you, quietly and early. It came in the silence when you asked your parents, what happens after? It came in bedtime stories where the hero always survives and the villain always dies. It came in religious threats, in textbooks that skip the subject, in movies that turn death into horror. You absorbed the message before you even had words for it. Death is something to avoid, to fear, to never talk about. But that was just the first mask. Behind it is one of the oldest tools of control. If you fear death, you can be controlled in life. If the unknown is terrifying, you'll stay in your lane, get the degree, take the job, pay the bills, obey the laws, and never ask too many questions. The whole system thrives on your fear of endings, on the quiet terror that one day, everything might just stop. That's why ancient teachings about death were buried, ridiculed, or locked away. Reincarnation was mocked, mystical texts were hidden, spiritual experiences were dismissed as hallucinations. Because if you knew what death really is, the illusion of power would collapse. If you understood death, you'd realize nothing they control can ever truly own you. Death was never meant to be feared. It was meant to be understood. Our ancestors knew this. The Egyptians mapped the soul's journey through the afterlife. The Tibetans wrote a guidebook for what happens after your last breath. Hermeticists said death is just a shift in frequency, a return, not an end. These weren't superstitions, they were instructions. You were never meant to live in ignorance. You were meant to remember. The more you peel back the layers of death programming, the more you see the real cost. It's not just fear, it's smallness, it's hesitation, it's a life half-lived, always running from the end. That hesitation infects your choices. You stay in toxic relationships because the unknown is scarier. You avoid speaking your truth because rejection feels like a kind of death. You put off dreams because failure feels fatal. You live as if time is chasing you, but you never really arrive. But what if you knew, truly knew, that death isn't the end of you? What if you lived every moment with the deep certainty that you are not this body, not this name, not this fleeting experience? The fear would dissolve, the hesitation would fade. You'd stop living to avoid death and start living in alignment with your soul. That's when everything changes. Life becomes sacred, not because it's fragile, but because it's eternal. They've spent generations building walls around this truth, but the cracks are showing. The fact that you're here right now means something inside you already knows. You felt it in dreams, in déjà vu, in those moments when time stretches and collapses. Death isn't the end, it's the doorway, and the fear you carry was never really yours. You were taught to see death as a final curtain, a black void, the cold end of everything you are, but that's not how the ancients saw it. To them, death was never a punishment. It was a passage, a sacred threshold, a return. You weren't meant to run from it. You were meant to prepare for it, not with fear, but with reverence. Death was an initiation, a moment when the soul sheds its temporary clothing and steps into the truth it always knew. In the ancient mystery schools of Egypt, initiates would symbolically die in darkness, only to emerge reborn, not because they learned something new, but because they remembered who they truly were. The goal was always the same: ego death before physical death. Because only when the ego dies does the soul finally speak. In Hermetic and Gnostic teachings, death wasn't feared. It was studied, understood, integrated. The soul wasn't a passenger, it was the driver. Death was simply the soul parking one vehicle before stepping into another. They understood that consciousness isn't a byproduct of the brain, it's the source, and that changes everything. If consciousness survives the body, the story doesn't end, it unfolds. The Tibetan Book of the Dead doesn't just describe death, it maps it. It tells you what happens to your awareness in the moments, hours, and days after your last breath. It speaks of the bardo, the in-between, where the soul confronts illusions, meets guides, and chooses its next path. None of it is random. It all depends on your state of mind, your vibration, your awareness. You don't rise to some heavenly realm by default. You move in the direction of your consciousness. That's why the ancient teachings were always about preparation, not fear. And preparation doesn't mean having your affairs in order. It means clearing your soul, knowing what you are beyond the body. So when the body falls away, you don't panic. You expand. Imagine a world where we raise children not to fear death, but to honor it. Where funerals are sacred celebrations, not sterile ceremonies wrapped in silence and sorrow. Imagine what would happen if we embraced death as the highest teacher instead of the greatest threat. Everything would change. When death is seen as initiation, life becomes a training ground for the soul. Every challenge is an opportunity to evolve. Every ending is a rite of passage. Pain isn't just suffering, it's purification. Fear becomes the doorway to truth. That's why this knowledge was hidden. Because people who understand death can't be controlled. They don't cling. They don't chase. They live fully, fearlessly, freely. Here's the paradox. The more you understand death, the more alive you become. It's not about morbid obsession. It's about sacred perspective. The ego wants to last forever. The soul cares about depth, not duration. That's what this initiation is about. Not how long you live, but how deeply you remember. When you see death not as an enemy, but as a mirror, it stops chasing you. You walk beside it, not in fear, but in understanding. And the truth is, you've died before. You just don't remember. But part of you does. Part of you has been whispering all along. You're more than this body, more than this name, more than this brief flicker of time. And death, when it comes, won't take anything real from you. It will only strip away the illusion. The truth was never lost. It was hidden in plain sight, wrapped in symbols, folded into myth, encoded in rituals, passed down quietly across the ages. You see it everywhere once you know what to look for. In the serpent eating its tail, in the cross, in the pyramid, in the Ouroboros. These weren't just decorations. They were maps, keys left behind by those who remember. So what do you do with this? You stop running from death. You let it remind you of who you really are. And you let that remembrance change how you live, deeply, honestly, and awake. Ask yourself, if you knew you had 6 months to live, what would matter most? Who would you forgive? What would you create? What mask would you finally take off? Now ask the real question. Why are you waiting? Because the truth is, no one knows when their final breath will come. with urgency. You need only to remember. To remember that you are more than this life, but that this life is sacred precisely because of its impermanence. You were never meant to spend your life clinging to illusions that crumble the moment your body does. You were meant to awaken before the end, to live not as a character playing it safe, but as a soul playing full out. That's the invitation, not to escape death, but to understand it, to walk with it, to be shaped by it in the best possible way. If this resonated with you, let me know in the comments. What would you do differently if you stopped fearing death? And if you want to go deeper, check out the links below. Thanks for watching. Remember, life isn't a countdown, it's a canvas. Paint it boldly,